On a frost-covered morning in March 2004 in the small town of Barton, Vermont, a young woman named Michelle Gardner vanished from her modest apartment on Elm Street. She was 23 years old, a part-time waitress at the local diner, a daughter, a sister, and according to those who knew her, someone who never missed a shift without calling ahead. Her car sat in the parking lot, keys on the kitchen counter, purse on the table, coffee still warm in the mug beside the sink. The door stood slightly ajar, a thin gap that let in the cold March air. By the time her mother arrived that afternoon, worried after unanswered calls, Michelle had been gone for hours. The apartment held no signs of struggle, no broken glass, no overturned furniture. Just that open door and the awful silence that followed. What happened to Michelle Gardner in those early morning hours? And why did it take 17 years for the truth to emerge from the very place everyone had been looking? The town of Barton sits in the northeast kingdom of Vermont, a region known for its dense forests, rolling hills, and isolated farmsteads that dot the landscape like forgotten relics of another century. In 2004, Barton was home to roughly 3,000 residents, most of whom had lived there for generations. The main street consisted of a general store, a post office, 2 churches, a hardware shop, and the Silver Spoon Diner where Michelle worked the breakfast and lunch shifts. The economy depended largely on logging, small dairy farms, and the modest tourist trade that trickled through during autumn when the leaves turned crimson and gold. People knew each other by first names. Doors were often left unlocked. Crime, when it occurred at all, usually involved teenage vandalism or the occasional domestic dispute. Michelle had grown up in nearby Newport, about 15 miles south, in a working-class family that struggled but held together. Her father, Robert Gardner, worked maintenance at the local high school. Her mother, Patricia, cleaned houses and took whatever part-time work she could find. Michelle had a younger brother, Daniel, who was 19 that year and working construction. She had moved to Barton 2 years earlier, drawn by the lower rent and the promise of eventually saving enough money to attend community college. She wanted to study nursing. Those who knew her said she had a quiet determination, the kind that showed itself not in grand declarations, but in the steady accumulation of saved paychecks and the nursing textbooks she borrowed from the library. The apartment she rented occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian house on Elm Street, a narrow residential road lined with maples and white picket fences. The landlord, an elderly man named Harold Pierce, lived on the ground floor and rarely saw his tenant except when she paid rent on the first of each month. Michelle's apartment consisted of a small living room, a kitchenette, 1 bedroom, and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub that she had mentioned to her mother needed regrouting. The walls were thin. Mr. Pierce said he could sometimes hear her television in the evenings, usually the local news or cooking shows. March 16, 2004 began like any other Tuesday. The temperature hovered just above freezing. A light snow had fallen overnight, leaving a thin white dust on the cars and sidewalks that would melt by noon. Michelle's alarm clock went off at 5:30 in the morning, as it did every weekday. Her shift at the diner started at 6:30, which gave her time to shower, dress, and walk the 3 blocks to work. She never drove unless the weather was particularly bad. She liked the walk, she had told her coworker Sarah Chen. It helped her wake up. But Michelle never arrived at the diner that morning. Sarah was the first to notice. She had opened the restaurant at 6, started the coffee, prepped the grill, and assumed Michelle was running a few minutes late. By 6:45, Sarah called Michelle's apartment. No answer. By 7:15, with the breakfast rush beginning and tables filling with loggers and early shift factory workers, Sarah called Michelle's mother. Patricia Gardner felt the first cold touch of worry. Michelle never missed work without calling. Never. She was the reliable one, the responsible one, the daughter who always checked in. Patricia drove to Barton immediately, the 15-mile journey feeling endless. She arrived at the Elm Street apartment around 8:30. The front door to the building was unlocked, as it usually was during daytime hours. She climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor and knocked on Michelle's door. No response. She knocked again, harder, calling her daughter's name. The door swung open at her touch. Clear's throat. The apartment looked almost normal. The living room was tidy, the small couch arranged with the same floral pillows Michelle had bought at a yard sale. The kitchenette showed signs of morning preparation. A coffee mug sat on the counter half full, the liquid still faintly warm to the touch. A piece of toast lay on a plate, one bite taken from the corner. The television was off. Michelle's purse sat on the kitchen table, her wallet inside containing $47 in cash and her driver's license. Her keys lay on the counter beside the coffee maker. Her winter coat hung on the hook by the door. But the door itself, the front door to the apartment, stood open about 6 inches. Patricia called the police at 8:43 in the morning. The Barton Police Department consisted of a chief, 2 full-time officers, and 3 part-timers. Chief Douglas Marsh arrived at the apartment within 10 minutes. He was a heavy-set man in his late 50s, born and raised in Barton, someone who had seen the town through decades of slow decline and stubborn persistence. He examined the apartment methodically, his boots leaving wet prints on the hardwood floor. He noted the warm coffee, the uneaten toast, the presence of all Michelle's personal belongings. He checked the bedroom and found the bed made, clothes folded in the dresser, nothing obviously missing. The bathroom showed signs of recent use. A damp towel hung on the rack. The shower curtain was pushed to one side. Chief Marsh asked Patricia about Michelle's habits, her relationships, her state of mind. Patricia explained that Michelle had no boyfriend currently, though she had dated someone briefly the previous summer. She got along well with her coworkers. She had no known enemies, no debts beyond her student loan from a semester of community college she had started and paused due to finances. She spoke to her mother by phone at least 3 times a week. The last conversation had been Sunday evening, 2 days prior, and Michelle had seemed fine, tired from her weekend shifts but otherwise normal. By 10 in the morning, Chief Marsh had contacted the Vermont State Police. By 11, a missing person report had been filed. By noon, officers were canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual that morning. Harold Pierce, the landlord, said he had heard nothing. He rose at 7 each morning, made his breakfast, and read the newspaper. He had not heard Michelle moving around upstairs, but that was not unusual. The house was old but solidly built, and he often did not hear his tenant unless she was vacuuming or moving furniture. The neighbor directly across the street, a woman named Ellen Whitmore who worked night shifts at the hospital in Newport, said she had arrived home around 6:15 that morning and noticed Michelle's lights were on, which was typical for that hour. She had not seen anyone entering or leaving the building. A teenage boy who delivered newspapers reported seeing a dark-colored truck parked on Elm Street around 5:45 that morning, a vehicle he did not recognize, but he could not recall the make or model and had not thought much of it at the time. By mid-afternoon, search teams had assembled. Volunteers from the community joined police officers and state troopers in combing the immediate area around the apartment building, the nearby woods, the walking route Michelle would have taken to the diner. They searched along the railroad tracks that ran parallel to Main Street, checked the small park 2 blocks away, peered into storm drains and abandoned buildings. The temperature had risen enough to turn the morning snow into slush, making the search muddy and cold. They found nothing. No signs of struggle, no discarded clothing, no drops of blood, No indication that anything violent had occurred anywhere along Michelle's usual routes. Her footprints should have been visible in the thin snow that had fallen overnight, but the morning sun and rising temperature had already melted most traces. The few partial prints investigators found near the apartment building were inconclusive, overlapping with other foot traffic from residents and delivery personnel. The investigation intensified. Detectives from the state police interviewed Michelle's co-workers, friends, family members, anyone who might provide information about her state of mind or recent activities. Everyone described her the same way: quiet, hardworking, reliable, no indication of depression, no talk of running away, no secret plans to start over somewhere else. Her bank account showed regular deposits from the diner and minimal withdrawals for rent and groceries. Her phone records revealed calls to family, a few local friends, nothing suspicious. The ex-boyfriend from the previous summer, a man named Kevin Torres who worked at the hardware store, was interviewed extensively. He had an alibi for the morning of March 16th. He had been at work since 6 in the morning, verified by his supervisor and 2 coworkers. He expressed shock and sadness at Michelle's disappearance and cooperated fully with investigators. Days passed, then a week. The search expanded to include surrounding towns, neighboring counties, and a wider radius of forest land. Divers checked the small lake at the edge of town, though it seemed unlikely Michelle would have gone there. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over the dense woods. Bloodhounds were brought in, given items from Michelle's apartment to establish her scent, but the dogs found nothing beyond the perimeter of her building. Those who knew the family said Patricia Gardner aged years in those first 2 weeks. Her face took on a hollowed quality, eyes red-rimmed from crying and lack of sleep. Robert Gardner took leave from his job at the high school and spent his days driving the back roads, searching places the official teams might have missed. Daniel, the younger brother, printed hundreds of flyers with Michelle's photograph and distributed them throughout the region, stapling them to telephone poles, leaving stacks at gas stations and grocery stores. The media coverage began modestly, a few stories in local newspapers, brief segments on regional television news. Missing woman, 23 years old, last seen in Barton. Anyone with information, please contact police. But as the days turned into weeks with no developments, the coverage diminished. Vermont saw its share of missing persons cases, most of which resolved within 48 hours, either with the individual found safe or, more tragically, with a body discovered. Cases that remained unsolved simply faded from public attention, relegated to databases and cold case files. Investigators noticed certain details that troubled them, small inconsistencies that individually meant little but collectively formed a pattern of unease. Michelle's apartment door had been found open, yet there were no signs of forced entry. The door frame showed no damage, the lock functioned properly, and Michelle had been careful about security according to everyone who knew her. She locked her door at night. She checked it twice. So why had it been open that morning? The coffee in the mug bothered them. It was still faintly warm when Patricia arrived around 8:30, which suggested Michelle had made it sometime after 7, maybe closer to 7:30. But her shift started at 6:30. Why would she have made coffee at 7:30 when she should have already been at work 2 hours earlier? The bite taken from the toast suggested interruption. Something or someone had stopped her mid-breakfast. But again, why was she eating breakfast at 7:30 when she should have been serving customers at the diner? Deputies whispered quietly among themselves, sharing observations they could not yet voice publicly. The apartment felt staged, one investigator noted in his report. Everything seemed too deliberately normal, as if arranged to suggest Michelle had simply stepped out for a moment and would return. Yet she had left without her coat on a cold March morning, without her purse, without her keys, without her phone. Chief Marsh reviewed the timeline repeatedly, looking for gaps or inconsistencies. Michelle's alarm went off at 5:30. She should have been in the shower by 5:45, dressed by 6, out the door by 6:15 at the latest for her short walk to work. But the physical evidence suggested she had still been in her apartment, making coffee and eating toast, at 7:30 or later. What had happened during those missing hours between 5:30 and whenever she actually disappeared? One theory proposed that Michelle had returned to her apartment after starting her walk to work, perhaps having forgotten something. But what? Nothing appeared to be missing. And if she had returned, why make coffee and toast? Why not simply grab whatever she had forgotten and leave again? Another theory suggested she had never left at all, that someone had been in the apartment with her that morning, someone who had prevented her from going to work, someone who had staged the scene to make it appear she had been preparing to leave. But who? And how had they entered an apartment that showed no signs of forced entry? The dark-colored truck the newspaper delivery boy had mentioned became a focus of investigation. Officers checked vehicle registrations, interviewed owners of dark trucks in the area, looked for anyone who might have had a reason to be on Elm Street at that unusual hour. They found several possibilities, but no definitive leads. The boy could not remember enough details to narrow the search significantly. By April, 6 weeks after Michelle's disappearance, the investigation had slowed considerably. Every viable lead had been pursued and exhausted. Every witness had been interviewed multiple times. The physical search had covered hundreds of square miles of terrain. Investigators had no body, no crime scene, no suspect, and no clear indication of what had happened. Michelle Gardner had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and a half-drunk cup of coffee. The case officially went cold in the summer of 2004. It remained open, as all missing persons cases do, but active investigation ceased. Chief Marsh retired the following year, the weight of the unsolved case among the burdens he carried into retirement. The file was passed to the State Police Cold Case Unit, where it joined dozens of others awaiting new evidence or renewed attention. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the gnawing suspicion that something is not quite right, but cannot articulate exactly what troubles you, the years that followed Michelle Gardner's disappearance would have resonated with terrible familiarity. Because while the official investigation went dormant, another kind of investigation was just beginning, one conducted not by trained detectives, but by a mother who could not let go of certain small inconsistencies that bothered her, details that seemed trivial to everyone else but lodged in her mind like splinters. Clear's throat. Patricia Gardner became obsessed with a single question: why had Michelle's door been open? She replayed that morning endlessly, the climb up the stairs, the knock that went unanswered, the way the door had swung inward at her touch. She remembered the feeling of wrongness that had washed over her, the instant knowledge that something terrible had happened. But she also remembered something else, a detail she had not mentioned to police because it had seemed irrelevant at the time. The door had been unlocked, yes, but it had also been unlatched. The deadbolt had been turned to the unlocked position, and the handle lock had been disengaged. Michelle always locked both morning and night. Always. She had mentioned it to her mother countless times, talked about how she felt safer with both locks engaged, especially living alone. So if Michelle had left her apartment voluntarily, why would she have unlocked both locks? And if someone had forced her to leave, why would they have taken the time to carefully unlock both locks from the inside before departing? Patricia posed this question to the detectives, but they had no answer. It was, they acknowledged, unusual. But in the absence of other evidence, it proved nothing definitive. Months became years. The Gardner family tried to establish some semblance of normalcy, though the absence of closure made genuine healing impossible. Robert returned to his maintenance job but moved through his days mechanically, a man performing the motions of life without truly living. Daniel joined the Army in 2005, seeking escape in structure and distance. He served 2 tours overseas and rarely spoke about his sister, the wound too fresh even years later. Patricia could not move on. She kept Michelle's childhood bedroom exactly as it had been. Clothes in the closet, posters on the walls, stuffed animals arranged on the bed. She called the state police cold case unit every few months, asking if there had been any developments, any new leads, any reason for hope. The answer was always the same. No, Mrs. Gardner, we have nothing new, but we have not forgotten Michelle. In 2008, 4 years after the disappearance, a development occurred that seemed at first to offer hope but ultimately led nowhere. A woman's remains were discovered in the woods near the Canadian border, roughly 60 miles from Barton. The body was severely decomposed, identifiable only through dental records. Patricia endured 3 weeks of awful waiting before the identification came back. Not Michelle. Someone else's daughter, someone else's nightmare, but not Michelle. The years accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer of unanswered questions and fading hope. People in Barton who had known Michelle spoke of her less frequently. Life moved forward because it had to. The diner where she had worked changed ownership twice. The apartment she had rented was leased to new tenants who knew nothing of its history. The missing person flyers faded and peeled away from telephone poles, replaced by advertisements for yard sales and lost pets. But Patricia continued searching, not with boots and bloodhounds, but with documents and phone calls, and the slow, meticulous accumulation of information. She obtained copies of the police reports through Freedom of Information requests. She created spreadsheets and timelines, mapping out every known detail of that March morning. She corresponded with other families of missing persons, sharing information and strategies, learning how to navigate the bureaucracy of unsolved cases. She kept returning to the same questions: the unlocked door, the warm coffee, the missing hours between when Michelle should have left for work and when the evidence suggested she was still in her apartment. Something about the timeline nagged at her, a piece that did not fit, but she could not identify what troubled her so deeply. In 2011, 7 years after Michelle's disappearance, Patricia's marriage to Robert ended quietly. They had not fought, had barely spoken at all for months. The absence of their daughter had created a chasm between them that neither could bridge. Robert moved to Burlington, took a job at a different school, started a life that did not include daily reminders of what he had lost. Patricia stayed in Newport, in the house where Michelle had grown up, surrounded by photographs and memories, and the terrible weight of not knowing. Then, in the spring of 2013, something shifted. Patricia received a phone call from a woman named Jennifer Carlisle who lived in Barton. Jennifer explained that she had been thinking about Michelle Gardner recently, remembering the investigation, and something had occurred to her that might be important. She hesitated to bring it up after so many years, but it had been bothering her, and she thought Patricia should know. Jennifer had been working as a nurse at the hospital in Newport in 2004. She had known Michelle casually, had seen her around town, had spoken with her a few times. On the morning of March 16, 2004, Jennifer had finished her night shift at the hospital around 6:30 and had driven home to Barton. Her route took her down Elm Street, past Michelle's apartment building, around 6:45 in the morning. She remembered seeing someone that morning, a man, leaving the Victorian house where Michelle lived. He had been moving quickly, almost running, and had gotten into a dark blue pickup truck parked on the street. At the time, Jennifer had thought nothing of it. People came and went. It was not her business. But over the years, the memory had bothered her, especially the man's hurried movements and the early hour. Patricia asked why Jennifer had not mentioned this to police in 2004. Jennifer explained that she had been interviewed, along with dozens of other residents, but the detective had asked specifically if she had seen Michelle that morning, and she had not. The question had been about Michelle, not about unidentified men leaving the building, and truthfully, Jennifer admitted she had not made the connection at the time. It was only later, thinking back on the timeline and her own observations, that she began to wonder if what she had seen might have been significant. Patricia pressed for details. Could Jennifer describe the man? Not clearly, Jennifer said. It had been 9 years, but she remembered he had been tall, wearing a dark jacket, moving with purpose. The truck had been dark blue, possibly a Ford, though she was not certain. She remembered it because she had needed to slow down to let it pull out from the curb, and she had been tired from her shift and slightly annoyed at the delay. What time exactly? Patricia asked. Jennifer checked her old work schedules, which she had kept for tax purposes. Her shift had ended at 6:30. She had left the hospital by 6:40 at the latest. Her drive to Barton took 15 minutes, so she would have been on Elm Street between 6:55 and 7 in the morning. Patricia felt something shift inside her, a piece clicking into place. If Jennifer had seen a man leaving Michelle's building between 6:55 and 7, that meant someone had been in the apartment during the exact window when Michelle should have already been at work. It corroborated Patricia's suspicion that something had kept Michelle in her apartment that morning, that the timeline investigators had assumed was wrong. She contacted the state police cold case unit immediately. The detective assigned to the case, a man named Lieutenant Shaw, who had inherited the file in 2010, listened carefully. He agreed the information was potentially significant. He arranged to interview Jennifer Carlisle formally, taking a detailed statement. But 9 years had passed. Jennifer could not provide a description detailed enough to identify the man. The truck she remembered could have been one of hundreds in the area. Without more concrete information, the lead, while interesting, did not provide a path forward for active investigation. Patricia refused to accept this. She began her own inquiries, quiet and persistent. She talked to other residents of Elm Street, asking if anyone remembered seeing a dark blue truck on that morning or around that time. Most people could not remember anything specific from nearly a decade prior. But one elderly man, a retired postal worker named Arthur Jennings, mentioned that Harold Pierce, Michelle's former landlord, had driven a dark blue Ford pickup for years. Arthur remembered because Harold had once given him a ride when his own car had broken down. Patricia felt her heart rate increase. Harold Pierce, the landlord who had claimed to hear nothing unusual that morning, who had said he rose at 7 and made breakfast and read his paper, who had not even known Michelle was missing until police arrived at his door. She went back through the police reports, reading every word of Harold Pierce's statements. He had been interviewed 3 times during the initial investigation. Each time, his story remained consistent. He had heard nothing unusual. He had not seen Michelle that morning. He had no information that might help. But nowhere in his statements had he mentioned leaving his house that morning. He had said he rose at 7, made breakfast, read the newspaper. He had not mentioned going anywhere, getting into his truck, driving anywhere before police arrived. Patricia called Lieutenant Shaw again. She explained what she had learned, the connection between Jennifer's description of the truck and Harold Pierce's vehicle. Shaw listened, but cautioned against jumping to conclusions. Lots of people owned dark blue Ford trucks. Jennifer had not specifically identified Harold Pierce. The information was circumstantial at best. But Shaw agreed to look into it. He pulled Harold Pierce's file, reviewed his statements, checked his background. Pierce had lived in Barton his entire life, 76 years old in 2013, a widower since the late 1990s. He had worked as a carpenter before retiring. He had no criminal record, not even a traffic violation. He had owned the Victorian house on Elm Street for 40 years, renting out the upper apartment since his wife had passed. Shaw interviewed Pierce again in July 2013, a courtesy visit to ask follow-up questions about the morning of March 16, 2004. Pierce, now elderly and frailer than he had been 9 years earlier, repeated the same story. He had risen at 7, made breakfast, read the newspaper. He had heard nothing unusual from upstairs. He had not left his house that morning. Shaw asked specifically, "You did not drive anywhere that morning?" "No," Pierce said. "I was home all morning until police arrived." "Did you own a dark blue Ford pickup in 2004? "Yes," Pierce acknowledged. He had owned that truck for 15 years. He sold it in 2006. Shaw asked if Pierce would consent to a voluntary polygraph examination. Pierce hesitated, then agreed. The examination was conducted in August 2013. The results were inconclusive, not definitively indicating deception, but showing stress responses to certain questions about the morning of Michelle's disappearance. Still, inconclusive polygraph results were not evidence of anything. Shaw had no grounds for further action, no probable cause for a search warrant, no basis for an arrest, nothing but an elderly woman's persistent questions and a 9-year-old witness account that might or might not be relevant. The case remained cold. But Patricia did not stop. She could not. She had become convinced, through the slow accumulation of small details and stubborn persistence, that Harold Pierce knew more than he had admitted. She began driving past his house on Elm Street, watching, waiting, though she did not know what she hoped to see. She asked other former tenants if they remembered anything unusual about Pierce, any inappropriate behavior, any reasons for concern. No one had anything negative to say. He was a quiet landlord, kept to himself, maintained the property adequately. For those who have ever felt the terrible certainty that the truth is just beyond reach, visible but untouchable, the next several years of Patricia Gardner's life would have been agonizingly familiar. She knew, or believed she knew, but knowledge without proof is torment. Clears throat. In November 2016, 12 years after Michelle's disappearance, Harold Pierce was admitted to the hospital in Newport with congestive heart failure. His condition was serious. Patricia learned of this through the small-town network of connections and acquaintances. She did something then that she would later describe as either divinely inspired or desperately foolish. She went to the hospital and asked to see him. The nurses, not knowing Patricia's connection to the case, allowed her into his room. Harold Pierce lay in the bed, oxygen tubes in his nose, monitors beeping softly, his face gray and sunken. He was 80 years old, dying, and he recognized Patricia Gardner immediately. She sat beside his bed and spoke quietly. She told him she knew he had been in Michelle's apartment that morning. She told him she knew he had left in his truck around 7 in the morning. She told him that after 12 years, she just wanted to know what had happened to her daughter. She was not there to threaten or accuse, only to ask for the truth before it was too late. Pierce stared at her for a long moment. Then he began to cry, tears running down his weathered cheeks. He said, "I did not mean for it to happen." Patricia's hands shook as she reached for her phone to record, but Pierce shook his head. "No recording," he said, "just between them, because he did not have much time left and he wanted someone to know." He told her that on the morning of March 16, 2004, he had gone upstairs to Michelle's apartment around 6 in the morning. He had a key, as landlords do. He said he had been checking something, a water leak he claimed to be investigating, though his story became vague and inconsistent. Michelle had been there preparing for work. She had been surprised, uncomfortable with his presence. They had argued about something. He could not or would not specify what. It had escalated. He said she had fallen, hit her head on the kitchen counter. He said it was an accident. He had panicked. He had tried to help her, but she was not breathing. He had not called for help because he was afraid, because he knew how it would look. An old man in a young woman's apartment early in the morning. So he had done something terrible instead. He had carried her body to his truck, wrapped in a blanket from her own bed, and he had driven north into the deep woods near Lake Salem. He had buried her there, in a place he knew from his carpentry days, a remote location where old logging roads disappeared into dense forest. He said he had returned to his house, cleaned the apartment as best he could, tried to make it look like Michelle had simply left. The unlocked door, the coffee, the toast, all staged to suggest a normal morning interrupted. He had thought the police would assume she had run away or met with foul play elsewhere. He had never imagined the investigation would focus so intensely on that single morning, on the timeline and the inconsistencies. Patricia asked him where exactly he had buried Michelle. Pierce described the location as best he could, though 12 years had passed and his memory was failing. He mentioned landmarks, a collapsed barn, a granite outcropping shaped like a wolf's head, a particular bend in an old logging road. He drew a rough map on a napkin with a shaking hand. Patricia left the hospital and immediately contacted Lieutenant Shaw. She told him everything Pierce had said. Shaw listened with a mixture of excitement and frustration. A deathbed confession was powerful, but without a recording or witnesses, it was also potentially inadmissible. And Pierce was still alive, which meant it was not technically a dying declaration under the legal exceptions to hearsay rules. Shaw moved quickly. He obtained a warrant based on Patricia's statement and Pierce's partial confession. Officers went to the hospital to formally interview Pierce, but the old man had retreated into silence. He would not repeat what he had told Patricia. He asked for a lawyer. The search for Michelle's remains began immediately. Teams of investigators, assisted by ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, descended on the area north of Lake Salem that Pierce had described. The terrain was difficult, overgrown with more than a decade of new growth, crisscrossed with old logging roads that looked identical. The granite outcropping Pierce had mentioned could not be located, or perhaps there were several that might have fit his description. They searched for weeks, then months. Winter came and forced the suspension of operations. They resumed in the spring of 2017. Patricia joined the searches when investigators allowed it, walking the same paths repeatedly, looking for anything that might indicate her daughter's final resting place. In June 2017, on a humid morning when the mosquitoes hung thick in the air, a cadaver dog named Sadie alerted to a location approximately half a mile from the nearest logging road. The team began careful excavation. 2 feet below the surface, beneath a layer of old leaves and decomposed organic matter, they found a blue blanket, rotted and stained, but still intact enough to identify. Wrapped inside were human remains. The forensic identification took 3 weeks. Dental records confirmed what everyone already suspected. The remains were those of Michelle Gardner. Harold Pierce was arrested on June 27, 2017, and charged with second-degree ending of life and improper disposal of human remains. He was 81 years old, in failing health, confined to a wheelchair. The arrest took place at the nursing facility where he had been transferred after his hospital stay. He did not resist. He asked only if his lawyer had been notified. The news broke across Vermont like a thunderclap. The case that had gone cold 13 years earlier that most people had forgotten or relegated to the category of unsolvable mysteries suddenly dominated headlines. Local television stations ran special reports. National news outlets picked up the story. Missing woman found. Landlord arrested. Justice after 13 years. Those who had known Michelle reacted with a mixture of relief and renewed grief. Sarah Chen, her former co-worker at the diner, told reporters that she had never stopped wondering what had happened. The discovery of remains and the arrest provided some closure, but it also made the loss newly immediate and painful. Patricia Gardner gave a brief statement to the press. She said she was grateful that Michelle had finally been found, that she could finally be laid to rest properly. She thanked the investigators who had never closed the case, who had followed up on new information even years later. She did not mention her hospital visit to Pierce or her role in breaking the case open, though reporters eventually uncovered those details. The prosecution faced challenges. Pierce's confession to Patricia was hearsay, not admissible in court without exception. The physical evidence was limited after 13 years of environmental exposure. The blanket, while significant, could not definitively prove Pierce's involvement without additional corroboration. The case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. Jennifer Carlisle's witness account of a man leaving the building in a truck matching Pierce's vehicle, the timeline inconsistencies, Pierce's access to Michelle's apartment, the location of the remains consistent with his partial confession. Pierce's defense attorney argued that an 81-year-old man in failing health could not receive a fair trial, that he was not competent to stand trial, that the confession allegedly made to Patricia Gardner was the product of medication-induced confusion and should not form the basis for prosecution. The legal proceedings dragged through 2018 and into 2019. Pierce remained in custody, his health deteriorating. In March 2019, facing the likelihood of conviction and the prospect of dying in prison, Pierce accepted a plea agreement. He pled guilty to voluntary loss of life and concealment of a body. In exchange, prosecutors agreed to recommend a sentence of 15 to 25 years with eligibility for medical parole based on his age and health condition. On April 12, 2019, 15 years and 1 month after Michelle Gardner disappeared, Harold Pierce stood before a judge in the Caledonia County Superior Court and formally entered his guilty plea. When asked if he understood the charges and agreed with the facts as presented, he answered in a barely audible voice, "Yes, Your Honor." The sentencing hearing occurred in May 2019. Patricia Gardner was present, seated in the front row, flanked by her ex-husband Robert and her son Daniel, who had taken leave from his civilian job to attend. The courtroom was packed with reporters, community members, and others who had followed the case over the years. The prosecutor presented a detailed account of the crime. According to the agreed-upon facts, Harold Pierce had entered Michelle Gardner's apartment on the morning of March 16, 2004, using his landlord's key. His exact motive remained unclear, possibly an unwanted advance, possibly a confrontation about rent or apartment issues, possibly something else entirely. Whatever the initial reason, the encounter had escalated. Pierce had struck Michelle, causing her to fall and hit her head on the kitchen counter. Whether he intended to cause serious harm remained disputed, but the result was the same. Michelle had sustained fatal injuries. Rather than call for help, Pierce had made the decision to conceal the crime. He had wrapped Michelle's body in a blanket from her bed, carried it to his truck parked on the street, and driven to a remote location in the woods near Lake Salem where he had buried her in a shallow grave. He had then returned to the apartment and staged it to appear that Michelle had left of her own accord, leaving behind the unlocked door, the warm coffee, and the partially eaten toast that would puzzle investigators for years. The prosecutor read victim impact statements from Michelle's family. Patricia described the 13 years of not knowing, the sleepless nights, the destroyed relationships, the constant wondering what had happened to her daughter. Robert spoke of the guilt he carried for not protecting his child, for not solving the mystery, for eventually giving up and moving away. Daniel spoke of growing up without his sister, of the hole her absence had left in the family. Pierce's attorney argued for leniency based on his client's age, health, and the many years he had lived since the crime. He suggested that Pierce had carried the guilt for 13 years, that he was not the same man who had committed the crime, that incarcerating an 81-year-old dying man served no purpose beyond retribution.